We are now ready for our study in the last half of Romans chapter 1. In the last session, we covered the first 17 verses in which we saw the introduction, and we saw that Paul said that he had a stewardship responsibility to pray and to preach. Now, in looking at verses 18 through 32, we're seeing that the world is on trial before God, and that covers all the way through chapter 3, verse 8, 1:18 through 3:8. Now, what we want to see in the remainder of chapter 1 is God's judgment upon the Gentile world, and that we see in 1:18 through 32. And notice here in verse 18 that God's wrath is upon all who hold back the truth of God in wicked living. Now, notice, verse 18 says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven." Now, this word wrath is the Greek word orge, which speaks of hatred and anger toward sin and unrighteousness. Now, God has a hatred and a anger toward sin and unrighteousness, and that is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. It's revealed against all impiety toward God. That's the meaning of the word ungodliness and unrighteousness. That is unrighteousness of men. And the word unrighteousness speaks of injustice toward men. So mankind is having an impiety toward God and an injustice toward mankind, and these are the ones who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Now, this word hold literally means to retain or hold down, or they hold back. So his wrath is revealed from heaven against those people who are ungodly and unrighteous and that are holding back the truth of God in unrighteousness. So we see then God's wrath is upon all who hold back the truth of God by their wicked living in verse 18. Now, that is done for three reasons, as we see down through verse 31, or four reasons through verse 32. Now, first of all, in verses 19 and 20, we see that it's true because all people had a knowledge of God. They all knew that God was and is, and that's a knowledge that is innate in all humanity, but they reject it. Now, notice in verses 19 and 20, the reason this wrath of God is revealed toward people like this is because that which may be known of God. Now, notice the two words may be is in italics. What we have here would be better rendered is, because that which is known of God. The word known is a present tense verb, which means having been, can be known now, and continue to be known. That which is always known of God is manifest in them. Now, it is manifest in the realm or sphere of the individual. In other words, in creation of conscience, all mankind knows that there is God, that He's there, that there has to be a supreme and superior being. Now, how is that true? For God showed it to them. God hath showed it unto them. The word hath and it are added. The word showed is manifested. God manifested it not unto, but to them. It was manifest in various ways. Now, first of all, by creation and conscience, man knew that God was. Verse 20. For the invisible things of Him, the invisible things of God, because God is a spirit and spirits are invisible. So the invisible things of God from the creation of the world are clearly seen. Now, this word from would be better rendered since. That is, from the time of the creation of the world. Since the creation of the world are clearly seen. Now, notice here, invisible things are clearly seen. That is, they're seen in the sense of the understanding and comprehension. How is that true? Being understood by the things that are made. They are understood by means of the things that are made or in creation. Back in the book of the Psalms, chapter 19 and verse 1, the Word of God says this: "The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament showeth his handiwork." So all of the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament, all the things in the expanse of all space, reveals that God is. Now, all that you have out there in the universe is like good clockwork. It is very, very precise. And this had to have some calculating mind of an intelligent creator. And there's many things to make that manifest, and much information available to us to cover that subject. Now, these things make it known that God is. So he is known how? Two ways. First, in conscience, man knows that God is. Secondly, creation reveals that God is there. And indeed, it has been the testimony of missionaries in past years going into areas where the gospel had not gone and civilization had not come into them, that someone in a tribe that would be worshiping the evil spirits so that they would not hurt them, someone would begin to think and wonder, well, now, there had to be a God that created all of these things, a good God, all of this that is about us. Why don't we worship the good God and to protect us instead of the bad gods to keep them from harming us? And in many cases, a missionary would get into that area and find out that a person had been thinking that way, or that person would make a trek out from where their tribal life was, get in contact with the missionary and be saved, and find out that he'd been thinking in that fashion. Now, conscience and creation in all humanity knows that God is. So he's manifested unto them. How much is he manifest? Even his eternal power and Godhead, or literally Godhood, his divinity. Now, all of this creation makes known the eternal power of God. And it took a great deal of power for God to speak and bring it into existence in the order that it exists. And it also makes known his Godhood, that God is God. Now, this was for the purpose, so that they are without excuse. Now, that literally renders for them to be. The word are is a present infinitive, literally, to be. So it says, so that for them to be without excuse or without legal defense. Man has no defense he can make against God for his judgment upon them, because he has revealed himself in conscience. It's born within man. Also, the creation about reveals the fact that God had to be there as a creator. So we see that God's wrath is upon all mankind who hold back the truth of God by wicked living. First, because they all have a knowledge of God through conscience and creation. And secondly, because in knowing God, he was not reckoned as God, we see in verses 21 through 23. Because that, when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful. Now, when was this? What we're going to see in the following verses is a description of what we see in the signs of the zodiac. Now, this goes back historically all the way back to the days of Nimrod after the flood. And remember, at the time of Nimrod in the building of the Tower of Babel, Ham, Shem, and Japheth, who came off of that ark and who had a first-hand knowledge of God and his workings, they were still living at that time. Therefore, all of the people of the limited population of the earth at that time had a knowledge of God. Now notice what it says. Look at it again. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were they thankful. They did not give thanks to God, but became vain in their imaginations. Now that phrase, became vain, is an aorist passive, which says they were given over to worthlessness. That is, to think about worthless things. They were given over to thinking about worthless things in their imaginations or in their reasonings or in their inner thoughts and reasonings which they had. Rather than being thankful to God and being mindful of him, They began to think of the things in their own mind with their inner reasonings, and as a result, their foolish heart was darkened. Now, this word foolish carries the meaning of being foolish or senseless or undiscerning, unintelligible, without insight, without understanding. Heart was darkened. So their heart was darkened in this matter because they turned from God. They refused to recognize Him as God when they knew that He was God, and they went in their own way. Then he says in verse 22, professing themselves to be wise. Now, they profess to be very wise. Oh, we are a learned people. We are educated. We know better than this stuff of God. That is like many people today, embracing evolutionary philosophy and many other philosophies of the world, that any religion is just as good as the other and what have you. Professing themselves to be wise. This is an unfounded assertion. The word carries the meaning asserting or affirming themselves to be wise. They became fools. Now, this word fools is the word morion, from which we get the word moron. So they became morons, thinking that they were so wise, affirming themselves to be much wiser than the other people who believe in God. They became morons, and they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God. Now, God is an incorruptible being. He is one that is totally holy, completely apart from sin, holy, totally holy and just, and a loving God. So they changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into an image. That's the word icona, which means into an outward manifestation, representation, made like to corruptible man, and to birds, and to four-footed beast, and creeping things. This is what we find in the signs of the zodiac. So this carries us all the way back to the days of Nimrod, soon after the flood, in the days of the building of the Tower of Babel, when they had a first-hand knowledge of God, and Ham, Shem, and Japheth still being among them, and they rejected it and turned to go their own way. So, God's wrath is upon people like this, because they all had a knowledge of God, and because in knowing God, He was not reckoned as God and acknowledged as such. And thirdly, we see in verses 24 through 31 that also this wrath of God is upon them because in turning from God's revelation of Himself, they sought to satisfy their own lust and dishonorable passions. We find that to be prevalent in humanity today. And notice how he describes what mankind becomes like in verses 24 through 31. Wherefore, God also gave them up to uncleanness, that is, unto moral uncleanness. That's what they wanted. That's the way their heart and mind was reasoning. That's the way they were thinking. And God said, if that's what you want, go your way. Man has a free will of choice, and God created him that way. Had He created us as a robot that we could not do except what He wanted us to do, then there would be no glory to God, none whatsoever. He has to give us a choice to be a God of love and to have true love from an individual. So God gave them up to moral uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts. Notice that word, lust. That is the word that carries the meaning of passionate cravings. So the moral uncleanness of their own passionate cravings for immoralities, and that we find prevalent in humanity and becoming worse as time goes on, as is prophesied elsewhere would take place. So he says, He gave them up to the moral uncleanness through the passionate cravings of their own hearts. To do what? To dishonor their own bodies between or in the realm or sphere of themselves. To dishonor their own bodies. And the bodies of men and women alike, of mankind, are turned over to such dishonorable passions, to dishonor their own bodies, and doing it in the realm or sphere of themselves. Now, these are the people who changed the truth of God into a lie. The word changed would be better in exchanged. They exchanged the truth of God for a falsehood, for a lie, for that which was not true. So they exchanged the truth of God into those things that are not true whatsoever. And they worshiped and served. That word served is a word that carries the concept of religiously served. They worshiped and religiously served the creature, the created thing, more than, or literally rather than, the Creator. So again, they were worshiping, religiously serving the things that were created rather than the Creator who created them, who is blessed forever, or who is well spoken of unto the ages. Amen. Even so, Lord, that is a truth to be. Then in verse 26, for this cause, because mankind was like that, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. Now that phrase, vile affections, carries the concept of passions of dishonor or disgrace. All of their disgraceful passions, all their disgraceful and dishonorable passions they had, this is what God gave them up to. God giving man that free choice, you choose and I'll let you go the way you want to go. For even their women, now notice here, this word women is the word females, and the word men is not the word for men, but it's the word for males, carrying the same concept in either case. For even their women and their females did change the natural use into that which is against nature. That, of course, is clearly speaking of lesbianism. They turned from their natural use to that which was not natural. And furthermore, likewise, also the men, that is the males, leaving, or an aorist participle, having left the natural use of the woman, or the female. Now remember, what was the natural purpose of the female? God created man. Out of man, he created a woman as a helpmeet for him. And the Bible makes it clear in more places than one that the woman was created for the man, not the man for the woman. So he says the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another. That word burned carries the concept that they burned out. They were inflamed. They were consumed in their own lust one toward another. Now this word lust is a word that's not the same word that we saw up above that means passionate cravings. It's a word that carries the concept of having a reaching out for in order to appropriate one another. They reached out for one another, man to man, rather than reaching out to the female. They reached out to other males in order to appropriate and take for themselves what they wanted, one toward another. Men with men, or males with males, working that which is unseemly, or which is obscene, that which is out of form, that which is disgraceful, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error, which was meet or suitable or fitting, proper for them. Now, if you go back to the Old Testament law in Leviticus chapter 20 and verse 13, we'll not take the time to turn back there, you will find that under the law, that men who had this kind of relation one with another were to be put to death. Now, under grace today, and under the New Testament law of grace and love, that is not to be. We are to have a concern and a love for those people and a desire to bring them to a knowledge of Christ, turn from their perverted ways, and turn unto God and yield unto Him. But now, God turned them over to these kind of ways because that's what they passionately desired and craved and wanted, and not wanting to yield unto Him. But notice how He continues to describe the people who are like this. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge. Notice that phrase, not like to retain. That literally renders they did not approve. They rejected the knowledge of God in their own mind. So it says, they did not approve of God in their knowledge, that is, in their foreknowledge. They did not want a knowledge of God So God said, if that's what you want, go your way. Because notice what else it says. Because they did not approve of God in their foreknowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind. Now here you have a play on words in the Greek text. It doesn't show up so clearly here in your English. But that word reprobate means unapproving or rejecting mind. They did not approve of the knowledge of God. They rejected the knowledge of God in their mind and in their foreknowledge, so God turned them over to that kind of a mind. You want to reject me, you don't want me in your knowledge, that's fine. Go your way. It's your choice. And they were turned over to that to do and to continue to do. That's a present infinitive. Now, present tense in Greek is not identical to that in English. Present tense in English is to do right now. But in Greek, it's that which has an antecedent condition, it's present now, and it continues to be without cessation. So God turned them over to their disapproving mind to do and continue to do those things which are not convenient or which are obscene or out of form or disgraceful. That's what they wanted. So God said, you can have it. You can go your way. Being filled, verse 29. Now, this phrase, being filled, is one word in the Greek text, and it's a perfect participle, which means having been and continuing to be filled. They've been filled with all the things described in the following statements, and they are continuing to be filled with these things. Having been and continuing to be filled with all unrighteousness or injustice. They've been filled with it. They're continuing to be filled with injustice. And also fornication. That means literally harlotry. They've been filled with it. They're continuing to be filled with it, with their harlotry, their immoral purposes, and wickedness. Now this word wickedness speaks of malice, plots, sins. It's a word that implies a hearty acceptance of evil methods in order to obtain a selfish end. And we find that too prevalent even today in our own society. Covetousness. Now that word covetousness speaks of an insatiable greed, an insatiable desire and greed to have more, even at the expense of harming others. In the book of Colossians, we're told that covetousness is idolatry, and it is because covetousness secures the affections which properly belong to God. We should never have an insatiable desire for anything except God. And so they have an insatiable greed to have more and more, even at the expense of other people. Maliciousness. That word simply speaks of badness, malignity. In other words, it's an idea which is ill-disposed. It's a destructive tendency. It's a word that simply speaks of trouble. It's evil intent toward those who interfere with one's pursuits of selfish purposes. So they say, I don't want to hurt you, just don't get in my way because I'm going after what I want, and that's what I'm going to live for and have in my own life. So they are filled with these things, having been and continuing to be filled with these kind of sins. And then he says, full of envy. That word envy means ill will, jealousy, and spite. Being filled with it. Murder. Of course, we know what murder means. It means to slay, to kill, to murder another person. They're filled with these things. Debate. This word debate is not just debates as we think about people having a debate over something, but it's a word that carries the concept of a quarrel. Having a quarrel over something. A wrangling about something, to argue or dispute noisily and angrily, to have strife between yourself over these things. That's the word debate. And then deceit. The word deceit is like a decoy. It's a trick. It's a wile. It's an act or means of cunning deception. It's guile, where you deceive others. And then malignity. Malignity says they're full of these things now, which is bad character, mischievousness. It's the policy of putting the worst possible construction upon what other people say and what other people do. And then whisperers. This word whisperer speaks of a secret calumniator. That is, one who makes a false, malicious, and injurious accusation or report concerning someone else. It's casual gossip in order to destroy the reputation of another person. So they are filled with these things. And then he says backbiters. The word backbiters speaks of speaking evil against others, being talkative against. It speaks of being a slanderer of another person. It's one who deliberately and openly accuses other persons without any proof. And then notice he says, haters of God. That is, hateful to God. They are very impious and have no concern for the things of God and use his name in a defamed way. Then he says, despiteful. That word despiteful carries the concept of insulters. That is, they're maltreaters. They insult and maltreat other people. It's an arrogant insolence and contempt for others, and it's displayed in their cruelty toward them. And then he says proud, appearing above others, haughty, arrogant. And then boasters. It means a braggart, empty boasting for gain, embellishing what you want to say and making it sound greater and better. And then he says, inventors of evil things. That means a discoverer or a contriver of worthless, depraved, or injurious things. And then disobedient to parents. That means unpersuadable. That is contumacious, which is contemptuous disregard for the requirements of rightful authority. Not regarding the rightful authority of one's parents, and we see more and more of that, and even find it in some instances, in some manners, even promoted in social circles today of our nation and governmentally, as well as in some of the educational systems. Then notice in verse 31, without understanding. That means unintelligent, wicked, unable to reason to a logically sensible conclusion in spiritual matters. They're not capable of that because they've given themselves over to the things of the flesh. And then he says, covenant breakers. In other words, they're not agreed. In other words, they're treacherous to compacts. They're faithless to agreements. You cannot depend upon them. And then he says, without natural affection. That means unloving, without tenderness, without physical or instinctive affections toward others. A word that speaks of hard-heartedness toward others. It's referring to those who use kindred only for personal benefit and then betraying them when it's expedient for them. Now, this is seen today in our own society of a mother who kills a child, of a father who abandons his children, and children who neglect their parents, and on we could go with many other ways. No natural affection whatsoever. And then implacable. That means truceless. Without agreement between belligerents, even for a temporary suspension of hostilities. It's an unreasonable, being unreasonable by any appeals to humanitarian considerations or even kindness of nature. And then he says, unmerciful. That is, merciless. They have no mercy, no forgiveness toward the repentant, no compassion toward the weak. It speaks of having somewhat of a wolf pack attitude toward all others and with no pity whatsoever. I want what I want and I'm going to get what I want regardless of you. And then notice that we find the wrath of God is among all who hold back the truth of God in unrighteous, wicked living. First, because they have a knowledge of God, and secondly, because in knowing God, he was not reckoned as God and given thanks as God. Thirdly, because in turning from God's revelation of himself, they sought to satisfy their own lustful and dishonorable passions as described in what we've just looked at. And now, the fourth reason is because they purposefully reject God and they revel in sin, according to verse 32. Now notice what he says. Who, speaking of these kind of people, although they knew that God existed, creation revealed it, they had their own passions that they wanted to follow, and so God says, all right, you don't like a knowledge of me in your mind, go ahead and follow your own mind rather than the knowledge I would give you. So it turned them into all kind of wicked individual beings. Then notice verse 32. Who knowing, an aorist participle, who having known the judgment of God. Now this word judgment carries the meaning of righteous judgment. It's that which is declared right. So who knowing the righteous judgment of God, that they who commit or who are committing such things. Now look at that word commit. It's not just someone who commits these kind of sins that have been named here. But the Greek word is the word prosentes. Now that tells us that it's not only something that is done as being committed, it's more than just practicing it, but it's a word that speaks of they plan and practice. It means to occupy oneself with. They plan, they look forward to it, they anticipate it, they want to do it, they look forward to doing it, and that's what they want to do. Now, sometimes people know that things are wrong and they don't want to do it, but they do it anyway. That's not what he's talking about, just committing it. But he's talking about the people who see nothing wrong with it. They plan it, they promote it, they look forward to it, they look for a way to do it rather than not wanting to do it. So that's the word prosentes. They who are planning and promoting and they look forward to plan and practice these type of things, they occupy themselves with them, such things are worthy of death. They know that according to God's righteous judgment. God said so in his word. They are worthy of death who live that way. Now, knowing that, they not only do the same. Now, the word do is a present tense verb, which means they not only do and continue to do the same things, but more than that. They have pleasure in. Notice, they consent to, they heartily approve them that do them. This word do is the same word rendered commit earlier in the verse. It's the word prosentes again. They not only find pleasure in them, they not only consent to and heartily approve them that are looking forward to, planning, promoting, and practicing these things, but he says they do and continue to do the same things themselves. So they who practice and look forward to these things, such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but they have pleasure in them that are continuing to practice and to do them. So we find in this portion pertaining to the Gentile world in 18 through 32 that God's wrath is upon all who hold back the truth of God in unrighteous, wicked manner of living. And it's true because all of them had a knowledge of God from way back in the days of Nimrod. And it's even today in conscience, born into every man, plus creation reveals the fact that God is, even his godhood. But then in knowing that that's true, they didn't recognize God as God and give him thanks. And then because in turning from God's revelation of himself, mankind as a whole sought to satisfy their own lust and dishonorable passions, and God turned them over to them. You don't want a knowledge of me in your mind? You don't have to have it. You can follow your own mind, and it makes them all kinds of wicked individuals. And then God's wrath is upon them, fourthly, because they purposefully reject God and revel in sin. In other words, people who live in that way, they have pleasure in them and they do the same things while they know that God's judgment is upon such people. So we see God's judgment is upon the Gentile world at large because mankind as a whole is that kind.